Hello, this is Kyrasis, and in this Blood Death Knight analysis video, I'll be providing a quick overview on what is changing for Blood Death Knights in Mythic Plus for patch 10.2 based on the latest theory crafting available for the spec. If you want a more detailed breakdown, you can check out my written guide for patch 10.2, which should be released shortly before patch 10.2, or you can ask a question in the comments. In any case, this video is designed to be more of a quick guide, and it assumes, to at least some extent, that you have a general idea of how Blood Death Knight was functioning during Season 2 of Dragonflight. First, it is important to mention what is changing with Blood Death Knights themselves going into the new season. The only class change we are receiving is a 20% increase to Soul Reaper damage, our tier set is changing with the new patch, and we will be able to get a legendary axe this season, except we currently don't know how to get it or what it does. For what it is worth, this is the only time that I'm going to mention the legendary axe in this video, because we don't have any information on it. However, if we use the patch 10.1 Evoker legendary as a guide, the legendary axe is likely going to be a single season damage buff for Blood Death Knights of all specs, without much other implications beyond that. So, unless the legendary axe is providing some very unexpected types of benefits and bonuses, it is not going to change any decision making associated with how we are building or playing our character. As such, the only changes that we are really considering for the rest of our build are the tier set bonus swap and the Soul Reaper buff. When it comes to the new tier set bonus, my old video is outdated at this point, since in the meantime, they have changed the effect to trigger off of runic power spent instead of bone shield charges consumed, and they have greatly buffed the effective proc rate of this tier set bonus. These changes fix almost all of the complaints associated with the tier set in raid settings, and raises the overall power level of the tier set to something a lot more respectable than what it was before. However, the issue of the tier set bonus being target capped in Mythic Plus was never really addressed over this PTR cycle. In any case, the most important thing with the new tier set is not the new bonus itself, but how things change as we migrate from the old tier set bonus to the new tier set bonus. The quick version of how these tier sets compare against each other is that the new tier set is more damage oriented than the old tier set bonus, with a bias towards smaller target counts, since the main method of applying and extending Ashen Decay is through Hard Strike. The benefits of the new tier set get penalized as target counts increase beyond the Hard Strike target caps, especially the damage reduction portion. Meanwhile, the old tier set bonus held up a lot better against larger target counts and provided stronger overall defensive benefits with an increase in major defensive cooldown uptimes with the random Vampiric Blood and Umbilicus Eternus procs. If you played Blood Death Knight in Season 1 of Dragonflight, your major defensive uptime levels are going to be a lot more similar to what they were in that season than what they were in Season 2 of Dragonflight. So the summarized explanation is that we are gaining damage while losing major defensive uptime and some generalized survivability. With this upfront tier set explanation out of the way, let us see what is going on with the talent trees. As for the Death Knight class talent tree, it is still the case where we are making a number of utility talent decisions depending on the exact dungeon we are in. While the dungeon conditions may end up being different in Season 3, nothing is changing with the individual decision making itself, since none of these utility talents have significantly changed in relative power levels. However, at the bottom of the talent tree, the 20% Soul Reaper buff we received, along with some indirect tier set synergy from the new tier set bonus, does elevate the power level of Soul Reaper to the point where it is now more of a consideration. So, while the fundamental trade-off at the bottom of the talent tree doesn't change, Soul Reaper finally provides enough of a priority damage increase where not only will it likely see heavy usage in Raid, but it may even see situational usage in Mythic Plus, if any dungeon conditions heavily emphasize priority damage over the even cleave AoE damage provided by Abomination Limb. However, this will depend on dungeon tuning and is far from a guarantee, especially given the clunkiness associated with using Soul Reaper, and it probably isn't something that you will see show up in the standard Mythic Plus build. That being said, if it does ever see use in Mythic Plus, you'll most likely see it used in place of Abomination Limb. Situations emphasizing priority damage are, by definition, not emphasizing even cleave AoE damage, while Empowered Rune Weapon is providing a significant amount of resource regeneration in a content type where that is generally very valuable. As for the Blood Talent tree, nothing fundamentally changes with any of the decision making you were making before, similar to the general class tree, though there are a few things worth noting. First, without the old tier set bonus, Umbilicus Eternus goes back to patch 10.0 power levels, which is a bit lower than what they are now. At the end of Season 1 of Dragonflight, Embellishments Eternus was still a part of the standard Mythic Plus builds, so there is no real reason to think that that will not remain the situation in Season 3. As before, there may be some specific uses for Bloodshot, so just remember that it is a part of your toolkit if the situation is appropriate. Meanwhile, the usual considerations between your final talent points still apply. Generally, your final 2 talent points end up in one of 3 places. Rune Tap is a good option if you know how to use it and if you want to strengthen your pole setup or defensive uptime, while Ironheart and Heartbreaker both strengthen your baseline mitigation through Death Strike effectiveness. There is some evidence that points to Ironheart being superior to Heartbreaker through player log data from the first 2 seasons, though a valid argument can be made for Heartbreaker based on better theoretical performance when fighting multiple targets and when the player has particularly good Death and Decay uptime. While other potential options for these talent points exist, there is not much of a reason to believe that they will be part of the more effective builds that we will see next season. Their combined damage and survivability performance does not look especially appealing, and player log data from Season 1 and Season 2 indicate that these talents consistently lead to worse outcomes in keys compared to using these talent points in either Rune Tap, Heartbreaker, or Ironheart. So to sum up the talent changes for both trees moving into Season 3 of Dragonflight, aside from giving Soul Reaper a bit more consideration than what we were giving it in previous seasons, there is nothing else that is significantly changing. With the talent discussion out of the way, there are several topics to touch on relating to itemization. First, let us touch on secondary stats real quick, since they have at least some impact on everything else in this section. That being said, Season 3 is not drastically changing things from what we saw before. Versatility and Mastery remain the 2 stats that look the strongest from a theory crafting perspective, followed by Haste, and with Critical Strike as the worst secondary stat. While the greater blood player base and spec theory crafting are usually in alignment on most topics, it is worth pointing out that secondary stats are the main point of disagreement between the 2 camps, particularly with regards to Haste. The general player base tends to treat Haste as the best secondary stat for Blood Death Knights instead of the 3rd best stat. While it is possible that the models are somehow not capturing the full value of Haste, I want to at least give a quick explanation about why Haste does not look as appealing as Versatility or Mastery from a pure theory crafting perspective. In Mythic Plus on a tank, we are generally concerned about 3 things: mitigation, effective health, and damage output. Mitigation reduces our reliance on external healing, effective health makes us more resistant against dying to burst damage, and damage allows us to kill enemies faster. I could potentially make a whole video on this topic because there are some deeper layers to this, but for now I'm just going to keep things at a basic level. If we are just comparing Haste against Mastery and Versatility, Mastery has a significant mitigation advantage over Haste, since the increase in blood shield healing from Mastery outpaces the increased overall Death Strike healing from the increased runic power generation of Haste, while the mitigation contributions of Versatility and Haste are very similar. Granted, Versatility significantly improves our effective health with its damage reduction effect, which isn't something that any of the other secondary stats provide in significant amounts. Meanwhile, Haste has one glaring weakness in Dragonflight: its damage. A lot of our major sources of damage do not scale with Haste at all. This includes Shattering Bone, Blood Plague, Abomination Limb, and Death and Decay. Notably, this is also most of our uncapped AoE damage on a Blood Death Knight. So, if you ever see Haste not being rated as better than other secondary stats on any lineup, this is the basis for why that generally is. That being said, it is certainly not our worst secondary stat and holds up decently well, all things considered. So it is generally more important to avoid our worst secondary stat than it is to min-max between the remaining three, at least in Mythic Plus. Critical Strike remains our worst Mythic Plus secondary stat for much the same reason it has been our worst Mythic Plus secondary stat for the better part of the last 5 years. You see, Death Strike mitigation scales very aggressively with anything that increases Death Strike effectiveness, to the point where other sources of mitigation for Blood Death Knights are a much smaller piece of the pie by comparison. That includes the parry contribution given by Critical Strike, while all other secondary stats primarily amplify Death Strike mitigation in one form or another. As such, Critical Strike mitigation is severely worse than the other three secondary stats, to the point where Critical Strike's small damage advantage is not enough to salvage the situation. And, due to the high amount of randomness involved and a lot of excluded effects, parry doesn't appear to provide a significant amount of protection against burst damage per point of the stat rating that you put into it. Aside from the modeling data, large samples of player log data from Season 1 and Season 2 of Dragonflight strongly support Critical Strike usage being associated with worse player outcomes. So, while rating might be a different matter, there is a reason it is heavily avoided in Mythic Plus and has been for a long time. So that's the general dynamic for what is going on with secondary stats. And that brings us to our next topic, embellishment effects. Back in Season 1, many Blood Death Knights were using Unstable Frostfire Belt for one of their embellishment effects. On its own, Unstable Frostfire Belt was not a particularly good embellishment for Mythic Plus back in Season 1, with both a weak stat line and a fairly low-powered single-target damage effect. That being said, what made this belt good in Mythic Plus for Season 1 was that it was the best way for Blood Death Knights to proc the Seal of Diurnus Chosen bonus effect, which required fire damage to trigger, and this effect did as much damage as the belt itself. When combined, it was very much worth using. Other than this one exception, secondary stat embellishments had stronger overall performance for Mythic Plus back in Season 1 for Blood Death Knight, including Elemental Lariat and the allied chestplate of Generosity. So one of these two generally occupied the second embellishment slot in Season 1 of Dragonflight. With Season 2, the Seal of Diurnus Chosen was not strong enough to see continued use in Mythic Plus. That being said, most of the direct damage effects were buffed by at least 82% before patch 10.1 release. As it turns out, an 82% buff was more than enough to make direct damage embellishments more desirable than secondary stat embellishments even in Mythic Plus, with the best direct damage option being Shadowflame Tempered Armor Patch, which could be equipped in both embellishment slots with customized item slots and stat lines. Now, in Season 3, we are seeing a 35% nerf to the same direct damage embellishment effects, which brings their power level much closer to where they were back in Season 1. And since Seal of Diurnus Chosen is long gone at this point, this means that secondary stat embellishments, once again, look like the more effective option for Mythic Plus in Season 3. That being said, there are short-term inconveniences with both of these items at the start of a season, since we won't initially have full sockets for Elemental Lariat to be at full power, and the allied chestplate of Generosity takes up a tier armor slot and could delay tier set bonus acquisition in the short term. As for trinkets, we are just going to talk about the main ones of interest for Mythic Plus. While most trinkets we are talking about are new, that is not the case for the Prophetic Stone-Scaled Cheat Death Trinket. It should come as no surprise that this is generally a part of your best Mythic Plus trinket setup. While this trinket can't be analyzed with traditional model-based theory crafting, it had some of the best average player outcomes from large sample log analysis during Season 2. Pair that with the fact that the overall trinket power level is weaker in the Season 3 pool of trinkets, and I think you will be satisfied with its performance in most situations over the alternative. That being said, there may be some situations where you don't want to wear one, particularly on tyrannical weeks, or if one of the new dungeons has a unique type of bottleneck that requires different types of bonuses. Now for something a lot more situational. Cataclysmic Signet Brand is a very, very odd trinket. This is one of those trinkets that snowballs in power as long as you maintain combat for a long period of time, but it grows in power exponentially with stacks and takes around 3 to 4 minutes to reach full power. Below 10 stacks, this trinket is not particularly good, and on the lower end of the stack counts, I would even say that it is terrible. That being said, at around 15 stacks, this thing is absolutely insane with the amount of damage it puts out. Looking at Anvil logs in Mythic Plus last season makes me think that this trinket probably isn't going to be very good in a realistic dungeon setting, since there are often a lot of moments that will force you to lose all of your stacks. However, if you can somehow manage to sustain high stacks in this thing for very long periods of time, you could justify it. Or even if you just manage to maintain high stacks through a particularly important segment of the dungeon. Now, will it be used at the end of the day? Probably not, but it isn't impossible that a situation shows up where it could be justified, which is why I am even bothering to talk about it here. As for Firak's Tainted Rage Heart, this is just an unconditionally good trinket. I know there are a lot of separate spell effects going on here, but long story short, this is mainly an on-use AoE split damage trinket that plays a very similar role and has a very similar general power level to Beacon to the Beyond from last season, except without the annoying cast time to use it. After taking the self-damage into consideration, the net healing effect isn't particularly large, though I guess it could be used to protect against one-shots in a pinch. Still, if you are using this trinket at all, you should generally be using it very aggressively because the damage is why we are here and taking this in the first place. The passive damage aura certainly moves the needle a little bit, but is only a small share of the overall damage this trinket is doing, unless you are doing a pull size that is very, very large. In addition to just being a numerically strong damage trinket, it can also be used as a form of burst damage if you have a specific application in mind, like boss ads that need to die very quickly, or totems such as what we saw during Season 2 of Dragonflight. Whether or not we have those, we'll see. I haven't been looking over the dungeons too much. And even if you are only limited to a heroic version of this trinket, you will still be interested in using it, because despite a large amount of secondary stats that exist this season, there is nothing that is on the same power level as Ominous Chromatic Essence to compete with this trinket slot. In any case, given the current power levels in the trinket pool for Season 3, a lot of the stronger Mythic Plus options for Blood Death Knights past this point are all secondary stat trinkets. Of the secondary stat trinkets, Ember of Nullification is generally the most appealing. It is a passive versatility trinket, but it is looking like the second best unconditional trinket at our disposal for Mythic Plus. Boring? Yeah, probably, but it is reasonably effective. It also has this free silence effect that probably isn't going to do anything most of the time, but we're not too concerned about that anyway. If we keep going down the line, there are a number of slightly weaker and mostly secondary stat-based alternatives to choose from, as shown, though there isn't too much to say about them. Again, it's just different types of secondary stat effects for the most part. Finally, let us touch on gameplay, since you may be wondering whether or not the tier set causes us to change our rotation at all. For better or for worse, the short answer is no. While it is possible to change some priorities and slightly improve the uptimes on Ashen Decay with more strategic ability timings, doing this penalizes our general survivability and damage throughput to the point where the cost outweighs the benefits, and if it didn't, we would have made these rotational changes without this tier set. As such, the same normal rotation rules apply. If you are looking for full details on the rotation, you can check out my written guide. Otherwise, I'm just going to do a lightning round on rotational best practices. When Death Striking, we want to either be using Death Strike at low health to keep ourselves alive, or at high runic power to avoid excess runic power waste. We very much want to minimize Death Strikes made at both high health and low runic power, since we would be better off pooling runic power in this range rather than spending it for low healing gains. Only Morrowind at less than 8 stacks of Bone Shield, or to refresh Bone Shield when it is about to expire, otherwise you're wasting Bone Shield generation and indirectly runic power. Much the same, we never want to drop below 5 stacks of Bone Shield, otherwise we lose Ossuary runic power cost reduction on Death Strike. Because of this, we will often want to stay comfortably above 5 stacks, so that when we use Tombstone, which will forcibly put us below Ossuary regardless of what we do, it will take less time for us to get back into Ossuary range. Blood Boil takes priority over Heart Strike when initially applying Blood Plague, but after Blood Plague is applied to all enemies, worry about staying below 4 runes more than staying below 2 charges of Blood Boil, and prioritize further rune use after you satisfy all of these conditions, as long as it is not disrupting your Bone Shield economy. Setting up pulls cleanly is all about efficiently getting through your initial global cooldowns and minimizing the damage you are taking in the process of setting up the pull. Abomination Limb, Dancing Rune Weapon, and Death and Decay are important setup abilities that you can often use at range when running into pulls and speeding up your setup. While the Engineering Tinker Nitro Boost is something I would recommend on all Blood Death Knights, which can greatly improve your mobility. Nowadays, they are generally more valuable than potions, because they haven't even updated potions in the last 3 seasons. Death's Caress should not be generally used over Morrowind. Instead, you should only be using it as a ranged filler for pull setup purposes, and when you literally have no other action you want to use with the cast time. In all other scenarios, use Morrowind. Death's Caress is rune efficient for what it does, but it hogs up too much cast time under normal circumstances, and you will start to lose cast of other abilities if you use it too much, which quickly makes it look like a bad trade. Generally prioritize stronger defensive cooldowns over weaker ones to get the most value out of your defensive cooldowns. For much the same reason, try not to excessively stack defensive effects. Defensive cooldowns are more effective at mitigating overall damage taken when they are used independently, so only stack if needed. And remember, for the sake of your defensive cooldown rotation, you should be treating an Umbilicus Eternus shield of a significant enough size as a standalone defensive cooldown, so you don't want to stack defensive cooldowns excessively with that either. In conclusion, only a few things have changed with Blood Death Knights moving into Season 3 of Dragonflight, but we were able to review the current situation with talents, itemization, and a few rotational nuances. As always, feel free to stop by the channel Discord if you want to talk about Blood Death Knight theory crafting, if you'd like a Mythic Plus log review, or if you have Mythic Plus related questions. The channel Discord information, as well as my personal Discord contact information, is in the video description below. Let me know what you think about Blood Death Knights going into the upcoming season in the comments, and if you want to make it easier for other people to find this content, feel free to upvote the video and subscribe to the channel. In the meantime, good luck, and have fun.